Maria Santos never imagined that the same hands that styled hair for military wives would one day hold a rifle against enemy forces. She never thought her small salon on the edge of a remote military outpost would become the last line of defense between captured Navy SEALs and certain death. When 63 enemy fighters surrounded the base that fateful morning, Maria faced an impossible choice: flee to safety or risk everything to save the men who had protected her community. What happened next would transform a humble hairdresser into an unlikely war hero, proving that courage doesn't always come from those who wear uniforms. Sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places, wielding the most unlikely weapons, and standing firm when retreat seems like the only option. This is the true story of how one woman's salon became a fortress, how beauty tools became instruments of survival, and how the bonds forged in a small military community proved stronger than fear itself. Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead as she arranged the last of her hair tools on the small counter. The morning sun was already beating down on the metal roof of her salon, a converted shipping container that sat on the edge of forward operating base Kilo in the remote mountains of Afghanistan. The sound of helicopters overhead had become as familiar as the buzz of her hair clippers. She had arrived at the base 6 months earlier as part of a civilian contractor program, bringing a small piece of normalcy to the wives and female personnel stationed in this harsh environment. What started as a simple business opportunity had grown into something much more meaningful. Her salon had become a gathering place, a sanctuary where military spouses could escape the constant tension of base life and remember what it felt like to feel beautiful. The base was small, housing fewer than 200 personnel, but it served as a crucial intelligence outpost, monitoring enemy movement through the mountain passes. The men and women stationed here were far from home, far from comfort, and Maria's salon provided something that no amount of military training could offer: a moment of peace. Lieutenant Sarah Chen was her first customer that morning, settling into the makeshift styling chair with a tired smile. Sarah worked in communications, monitoring radio chatter, and coordinating with other outposts. The dark circles under her eyes told the story of too many sleepless nights, listening to enemy transmissions.
"The usual trim?" Maria asked, running her fingers through Sarah's long black hair.
The young officer nodded, closing her eyes as Maria began her work. These moments of human connection had become precious commodities on the base. "Any word from home?" Maria asked softly. She had learned that her customers often needed to talk as much as they needed grooming. Sarah's husband was deployed elsewhere in the region, and their separation weighed heavily on both of them. "He's safe for now," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But intelligence reports have been concerning lately. There's been increased enemy activity in the surrounding valleys. Command thinks they might be planning something big. Maria's hands never stopped moving, but her mind processed this information carefully. Over the months, she had become an unofficial confessor to the women on base, hearing their fears, their hopes, and sometimes sensitive information that they needed to share with someone outside the chain of command. The morning continued with its familiar rhythm. Captain Rebecca Martinez came in for color touch-up, her red hair beginning to show gray roots from the stress of managing base logistics. She spoke quietly about supply shortages and the challenges of keeping morale high when resources were limited. Next was Sergeant First Class Amy Rodriguez, whose husband served with the base's Special Operations Unit. Amy was pregnant with their first child, and every mission her husband undertook filled her with a mixture of pride and terror. Maria carefully trimmed around Amy's face, listening as she talked about feeling the baby kick and wondering if her husband would be there for the birth. "They're going out again tonight," Amy said, her hand instinctively moving to her growing belly. "Another reconnaissance mission in the eastern valleys." "Command won't say much, but I can tell it's dangerous by the way Jake looks when he comes home from briefings." Maria nodded sympathetically. She had seen the special operations teams preparing for their missions, watching the Navy SEALs and Army Rangers as they checked their equipment with the methodical precision that came from knowing their lives depended on every detail. As the day progressed, Maria noticed an unusual amount of activity outside her salon. Vehicles were moving more frequently between buildings, and she could see personnel gathering in small groups, their conversations intense and hushed. Something was different about this day, though. She couldn't quite identify what. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the base's chief medical officer, arrived for her weekly appointment looking more troubled than usual. As Maria worked on her shoulder-length brown hair, Jennifer shared her concerns about medical supply levels and her worries about a recent uptick in casualties from surrounding outposts. "We've had 3 emergency helicopters this week," Jennifer said, staring at her reflection in the small mirror Maria had mounted on the salon wall. all from different bases, all reporting enemy contact that was more intense than expected. It's like they're testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of heavy boots outside the salon. Through the small window, Maria could see a group of Navy SEALs returning from a patrol, their faces grim and their equipment showing signs of recent combat. Among them was Petty Officer First Class David Dutch Harrison, whose wife Emma was one of Maria's regular customers. Emma wasn't on the base currently, having returned stateside for the birth of their second child, but Dutch had mentioned her often during the few times he had stopped by the salon to deliver messages or pick up items Emma had left behind. He was a large man with kind eyes who always took time to ask about Maria's family back in the Philippines. As the SEALs passed by her window, Maria noticed something concerning in their body language. These were men trained to project confidence and control, but she could see tension in their movements, urgency in their communication. Whatever they had encountered on their patrol had been significant. The afternoon brought more customers, each carrying pieces of the growing puzzle. Master Sergeant Lisa Thompson, who worked in intelligence analysis, mentioned increased drone surveillance in the region. Corporal Jessica Lee, a supply specialist, noted that ammunition requests had doubled in the past week. Each conversation added another layer to Maria's understanding that something serious was developing. As evening approached, Maria prepared to close the salon for the day. She had learned to read the rhythms of base life, understanding when tension was building and when danger might be approaching. Tonight felt different from others. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that everyone was waiting for something to happen. The last customer of the day was Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, a military police officer who shared the same first name and had become a close friend. As Maria worked on her hair, Gonzalez spoke in low tones about increased security protocols and concerns about intelligence reports suggesting a major enemy operation in the works. "Command has put us on high alert," Gonzalez whispered, glancing around even though they were alone in the salon. "All leave has been cancelled, and they've doubled the guard rotations." "Something's coming, Maria. I can feel it." After Gonzalez left, Maria stood alone in her salon, cleaning her tools and preparing for what she hoped would be another routine day tomorrow. She had no military training, no combat experience, and no weapons beyond the scissors and razors of her trade. She was simply a hairdresser who had found herself in an extraordinary situation, trying to bring a touch of beauty and normalcy to a world defined by conflict. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the base. In the distance, she could hear the low rumble of generators and the occasional radio chatter from the communications center. The night shift was taking over, and soon the base would settle into the uneasy quiet that characterized their remote outpost. As Maria locked the door to her salon and walked toward her quarters, she passed by the Special Operations compound where she could see Dutch and his team conducting final equipment checks. Their mission would take them into the mountains tomorrow, following intelligence reports about enemy movements in the region. She offered a small wave, which Dutch returned with a tired smile. None of them knew that by tomorrow evening their worlds would be turned completely upside down. None of them could imagine that Maria's small salon would become the center of a desperate battle for survival. And none of them could predict that the quiet hairdresser who had spent her day listening to their stories would soon become part of a story that would test every ounce of courage she possessed. The night passed slowly, filled with the usual sounds of a military base settling into evening routines. Guards walked their posts, radios crackled with routine check-ins, and most personnel tried to get whatever rest they could before another day in this remote corner of the war. But in the surrounding mountains, 63 enemy fighters were moving through the darkness, converging on forward operating base Kilo, with plans that would transform Maria Santos from a hairdresser into something she never imagined she could become. A warrior fighting for the lives of the men and women who had become her extended family in this distant, dangerous place. The alarm pierced through the dawn silence at 054, jolting Maria from a restless sleep. She had been dreaming about her childhood home in Manila, where the sounds of morning were church bells and street vendors, not the harsh wail of emergency sirens that now filled the air at forward operating base Kilo. Maria quickly dressed and stepped outside her quarters to find the base in chaos. Personnel were running between buildings, and she could hear shouting from the direction of the command center. The morning air was crisp in the mountain altitude, but something else cut through the chill. The distant sound of gunfire echoed from the eastern valley, where Dutch and his SEAL team had been conducting their reconnaissance mission. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the base commander, was barking orders into his radio as he strode across the compound. Maria had styled his wife's hair many times during video calls home, and she knew him to be a calm, methodical leader. The urgency in his voice now sent ice through her veins. All units, we have teams in contact approximately 8 kilometers east of base. Requesting immediate air support and medical evacuation standby. Harrison's voice carried across the compound as he coordinated the response to whatever was happening in the mountains. Maria opened her salon early, knowing that in times of crisis, people needed familiar spaces and routine activities to help manage their stress. She was right. Within an hour, several wives and female personnel had gathered in the small space, drawn by the need for human connection during the uncertainty. Sarah Chen was the first to arrive, still in her pajamas under a hastily thrown-on jacket. Her role in communications meant she was likely hearing the real-time reports from the field, and her pale face told Maria that the news wasn't good. "It's Dutch's team," Sarah said quietly as she settled into the styling chair, though she clearly had no intention of actually getting her hair done. They were supposed to be conducting routine surveillance, but they walked into something much bigger than expected. Maria's hands moved automatically, organizing her tools even as her mind focused on Sarah's words. Dutch Harrison was more than just another soldier on the base. He had become a friend, someone who always asked about her family and shared stories about his wife Emma and their children back home. "How bad is it?" Maria asked, continuing to work even though her heart was racing. "Bad," Sarah replied, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. Intelligence reports suggested maybe 15 enemy fighters in the area. Dutch's team went in with 8 men, thinking they had overwhelming force. But when they reached the target location, they found themselves outnumbered at least 8-1. Other women began filtering into the salon, each bringing fragments of information that painted an increasingly dire picture. Captain Rebecca Martinez had overheard radio communications requesting emergency ammunition resupply. Dr. Costi. Jennifer Walsh was preparing the medical bay for potential casualties. Sergeant Amy Rodriguez was struggling to maintain composure as reports came in about her husband's unit. "They're surrounded," Amy said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's team tried to provide support, but the enemy has positions on multiple ridgelines. Our guys are trapped in a valley with limited cover and no clear exit route. Maria continued working, using the familiar motions of hairstyling to keep her hands steady while processing the gravity of the situation. She had grown to care deeply about everyone on this base, but Dutch held a special place in her heart. He had been one of the first people to welcome her when she arrived, helping her set up her salon, and always ensuring she felt safe and protected in this dangerous environment. Throughout the morning, the situation continued to deteriorate. Radio reports filtering back to base painted a picture of a well-planned ambush that had caught the SEAL team completely off guard. The enemy fighters weren't just random insurgents, they were well-trained, well-equipped, and operating with the kind of coordination that suggested significant planning and intelligence gathering. They knew exactly where our team would be. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez reported as she stopped by the salon during a brief break from her security duties. This wasn't a chance encounter. Someone leaked information about the mission, or the enemy has been watching us much more closely than we realized. The implications of this revelation sent chills through everyone present. If the enemy had detailed intelligence about base operations, no one was truly safe. Every mission, every routine patrol, every daily activity could be part of a larger trap waiting to spring. As the day progressed, Maria's salon became an unofficial information center where the women of the base gathered to share what they knew and support each other through the crisis. The space that had been designed for beauty and relaxation had transformed into something much more important, a place where a community came together to face uncertainty and fear. Dr. Walsh arrived mid-afternoon with updates from the medical preparations. "Command has requested helicopter evacuation support, but the weather is deteriorating rapidly," she reported. "There's a storm system moving in from the west that could ground all aircraft for the next 48 hours. This news hit everyone like a physical blow. If helicopters couldn't reach Dutch's team, there would be no way to extract them from their surrounded position. They would be on their own, facing overwhelming odds, with limited ammunition and supplies. How long can they hold out?" Maria asked, voicing the question that everyone was thinking but afraid to speak. "That depends on a lot of factors," Walsh replied grimly. "Ammunition, water, medical supplies, and whether the enemy decides to wait them out or launch a direct assault. Our teams are well-trained and resourceful, but 8 men against 60 or more is not sustainable for an extended period." As evening approached, the radio reports became increasingly desperate. Dutch's team had managed to find defensive positions among a cluster of rocks and trees, but they were taking continuous fire from multiple directions. Several team members had been wounded, though none critically yet. Ammunition was running low, and the enemy seemed content to maintain their siege rather than risk casualties in a direct assault. They're playing a waiting game, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison explained during a briefing that Maria overheard while walking past the command center. The enemy knows our extraction capabilities are limited by weather, so they can afford to be patient. Time is on their side. That night, Maria stayed late in her salon, unable to return to her quarters while Dutch and his team remained in mortal danger. Several other women joined her, creating an impromptu vigil where they shared stories, prayers, and hopes for the safe return of their friends and loved ones. Sarah Chen remained in constant contact with the communication center, providing updates whenever new information came through. They're still holding position, she reported around midnight. Enemy probes throughout the night, but no major assaults yet. Medical reports indicate 2 wounded, but they're still combat effective. As the second day dawned with no improvement in weather conditions, the reality of the situation began to sink in fully. Dutch's team was trapped, surrounded by a force that outnumbered them nearly 8-1, with no realistic possibility of air support or extraction. The enemy could afford to wait, gradually wearing down their ammunition and morale until resistance became impossible. Command is considering ground-based relief options, Captain Martinez reported, though her tone suggested these options were limited, but any rescue mission would require sending more personnel into the same trap that caught Dutch's team. The risk of losing even more people is enormous. Maria found herself thinking constantly about Emma Harrison and the children who were waiting at home for their father to return safely. She remembered Dutch showing her pictures of his family, talking about his plans for leave time and his excitement about watching his daughter's soccer games when he got back to the States. On the third day, everything changed. Radio contact with Dutch's team became sporadic, then stopped entirely. The last transmission was brief and crackling with static. Position compromised. Enemy advancing. We'll hold as long as possible. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since the crisis began, Maria felt the full weight of helplessness settling over everyone on the base. Dutch Harrison and his 7 teammates were out there somewhere, fighting for their lives against impossible odds, and there was nothing anyone could do to help them. It was then that Maria made a decision that would change everything. Looking around at the faces of the women who had become her family over these months, seeing their pain and desperation, she realized that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought by those wearing uniforms. Sometimes courage comes from the most unexpected sources and takes forms that no one could predict. We can't just sit here waiting, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence in the salon. If command can't send help because it's too dangerous, maybe it's time to consider options that aren't part of standard military procedure. The women looked at her with confusion, not yet understanding what she was suggesting. But Maria Santos, the hairdresser who had come to this remote base to provide beauty services, was about to propose something that would either save the men she cared about or cost everyone their lives. Maria's words hung in the air of the small salon, like smoke from a battlefield. The women stared at her, trying to process what she had just suggested. Outside, the storm that had grounded all aircraft continued to rage. And somewhere in the mountains, Dutch Harrison and his team remained trapped with no hope of conventional rescue. "What exactly are you proposing?" Dr. Jennifer Walsh asked, her medical training making her naturally cautious about any plan that might put more lives at risk. The dark circles under her eyes spoke to 3 days of preparing for casualties that might never make it back to base for treatment. Maria stood slowly, moving to the small window of her salon, where she could see the eastern mountains disappearing into storm clouds. For 3 days, she had listened to the women of Forward Operating Base Kilo share their fear, their helplessness, and their growing desperation. These were strong, capable women who served their country and community with distinction, but they were watching their friends and loved ones die without being able to act. "I know these mountains," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even herself. Not from military maps or intelligence briefings, but from 6 months of listening to everyone who comes through this salon. "Sarah, you've told me about every patrol route because you coordinate their communications. Rebecca, you've explained supply lines and cache locations because managing logistics is what keeps you awake at night. Amy, you've shared every detail of the terrain your husband's unit operates in because talking about his missions helps you cope with the fear."
The women exchanged glances, beginning to understand where Maria's thoughts were leading.
Each of them had indeed shared far more operational details than they probably should have, but the salon had become a place of trust, a sanctuary where they could speak freely about their burdens and fears. "You're talking about us going out there ourselves," Staff Sergeant Gonzalez said, her military police training making her immediately grasp the implications. "Maria, we're not combat soldiers. Half of us have never fired a weapon outside of basic training, and none of us has experience with actual warfare. Neither did the farmers at Lexington and Concord, Maria replied, drawing on a piece of American history she had studied when preparing for her citizenship exam. Neither did the French resistance fighters who helped Allied soldiers escape Nazi territory. Sometimes wars are won not by armies, but by ordinary people who refuse to accept that nothing can be done. Lieutenant Sarah Chen set down the cup of coffee she had been holding, her communications training making her consider the logistical aspects of what Maria was suggesting. Even if we could somehow reach their position, what would we do? 8 Navy SEALs couldn't fight their way out of that situation. How could a group of untrained civilians make any difference? Maria turned from the window, and for the first time in 3 days there was something other than despair in her expression. Because we wouldn't be trying to fight our way out. We would be doing something the enemy isn't expecting. Something that doesn't follow any military playbook they might have studied.
She moved to a small map on the salon wall, one she had marked with locations mentioned by her customers over the months.
Red pins indicated where patrols had encountered enemy forces. Blue pins marked supply cache locations. Green pins showed safe houses and rally points that had been established for emergencies. The enemy surrounded Dutch's team because they knew where a military rescue would come from, Maria continued, her finger tracing routes on the map. They positioned their fighters to block the obvious approach routes and maintain overwatch on all the standard extraction points. But they're not watching for something that makes no military sense. Captain Rebecca Martinez leaned forward, her logistics experience helping her follow Maria's reasoning. You're talking about an approach that no trained military unit would ever attempt because it would violate every principle of tactical movement. Exactly, Maria nodded. We go in the way no soldier would go, carrying equipment no military unit would carry, using methods that would fail any army manual but might succeed precisely because they're so unconventional. Dr. Walsh shook her head, her medical oath making her reluctant to support any plan that would put more lives at risk. Maria, even if your strategy could somehow work, the physical requirements would be enormous. We're talking about mountain terrain in winter weather. Possibly 12 to 15 hours of movement through enemy territory. I've been hiking these mountains every weekend for 6 months, Maria replied. Not for recreation, but because I needed to understand this place if I was going to live here safely. I know paths that aren't on any military map, routes that local shepherds used for generations before this war ever started. Sergeant Amy Rodriguez placed a protective hand over her pregnant belly. Torn between her desire to help save her husband and her responsibility to her unborn child. What about equipment, weapons, communications? We can't just walk into a war zone with good intentions. The base armory includes civilian contractor weapons, Gonzalez noted reluctantly. Pistols and rifles that were issued for base defense. And there are emergency communication devices that don't require military radio protocols. As the women discussed the impossible plan taking shape in their minds, each began to realize they possessed skills and knowledge that could actually prove valuable in an unconventional rescue attempt. Sarah's communications expertise would be crucial for coordination. Rebecca's logistics background would help with supply and equipment requirements. Jennifer's medical training would be essential if they encountered wounded personnel. Gonzalez's military police experience provided the closest thing to combat training among them. The storm provides cover, Maria observed, watching snow swirl past the salon window. Visibility is limited, which means enemy lookouts won't be as effective, and the weather is keeping their aircraft grounded just like ours. It also means we could die of exposure before we ever reach the target area. Doctor, Walsh pointed out grimly. Mountain weather kills more soldiers than enemy fire in this region. Then we better plan carefully and move quickly, Maria replied with a determination that surprised everyone present, including herself. Over the next several hours, the group found themselves developing a detailed plan that violated every principle of military science while somehow making logical sense. They would move in a single group, avoiding radio communication until absolutely necessary. They would follow paths known only to local civilians, staying off established trails where enemy forces might expect military movement. They would carry minimal equipment, prioritizing mobility over firepower. Most importantly, they would rely on the one advantage that no enemy force could predict or counter, their intimate knowledge of the personalities, capabilities, and likely reactions of the men they were trying to save. Dutch will have positioned his team in a defensive perimeter, but he'll have left himself the most exposed position, Amy noted, her knowledge of her husband's fellow soldiers helping to predict their current situation. He always puts his men's safety ahead of his own, which means he'll be the one taking the greatest risks to protect the others. The team medic will be Petty Officer Martinez, Sarah added from her communications experience. If anyone has been wounded, he'll be focused on medical care rather than defense, which might create opportunities for an extraction that wouldn't exist under normal circumstances. As their plan developed, each woman began to understand that they were contemplating something that could either save 8 lives or result in the deaths of everyone involved, including themselves. The mathematical reality was stark. They were preparing to walk into a situation where professional soldiers with superior training and equipment had become trapped, hoping to succeed where military rescue had been deemed impossible. But they also understood something that no amount of military training could teach: the power of refusal to accept defeat when people you care about are in mortal danger. If we're really going to do this, Dr. Walsh said finally, we need to be completely honest about what we're risking. This isn't a movie where courage automatically leads to success. This is a situation where good people die despite everyone's best efforts. Good people are already dying, Maria replied quietly. Dutch and his team are out there right now, fighting against impossible odds while we sit here safe and warm, debating whether it's too dangerous to help them. At what point does safety become cowardice? The question settled over the room like a weight, forcing each woman to confront her own definition of duty, friendship, and moral obligation. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and the radio remained silent from the mountain valley where 8 American soldiers waited for help that conventional military doctrine said could never come. As night fell over Forward Operating Base Kilo, 5 women prepared to embark on a mission that would either prove that courage and determination could overcome impossible odds, or serve as a tragic reminder that good intentions cannot always triumph over brutal reality. The last entry in Maria's diary that night was simple. Tomorrow we discover whether love is stronger than fear, and whether ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when the people they care about need them most. The pre-dawn darkness at Forward Operating Base Kilo was thick with more than just mountain mist. At 0400 hours, 5 women moved through shadows between buildings, each carrying equipment that would have seemed impossibly inadequate for a military rescue operation, yet perfectly suited for the unconventional mission they had planned. Maria Santos adjusted the straps of her backpack, feeling the weight of medical supplies, emergency rations, and communication equipment that Dr. Walsh had requisitioned from base stores without official authorization. The pack also contained her hair scissors and a small mirror, items that seemed absurdly civilian in the context of a combat rescue, but had become symbols of her determination to remain true to herself even in the face of war. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez had managed to obtain 5 pistols and 2 rifles from the civilian contractor armory, along with ammunition that she hoped they would never need to use. Her military police training made her the closest thing to a combat leader the group possessed, though she was acutely aware that her experience with base security bore little resemblance to the mountain warfare they were about to attempt. Final communications check. Lieutenant Sarah Chen whispered into her emergency radio, confirming contact with the base command center without revealing the true nature of their mission. She had arranged cover stories for their absence, claiming a civilian contractor inspection of remote facilities that would explain their departure without triggering immediate searches. Captain Rebecca Martinez carried the heaviest load, her logistics background having helped identify exactly what supplies would be essential for survival in the mountains while maintaining the mobility necessary for their unconventional approach. Every item in her pack had been chosen for maximum utility with minimum weight, from emergency shelter materials to high-energy food supplies. Dr. Jennifer Walsh brought medical equipment that could mean the difference between life and death if they encountered wounded personnel, though she was painfully aware that her emergency medical training had never been intended for battlefield conditions. Her hands shook slightly as she checked her supplies one final time, not from cold but from the enormity of what they were attempting. The storm that had grounded all aircraft for 4 days showed signs of beginning to clear, but the mountains remained shrouded in clouds that would provide essential cover for their movement. Maria had studied weather patterns during her months on the base, understanding that they had perhaps a 6-hour window of visibility protection before conditions improved enough for enemy aircraft to resume operations. "Remember the route," Maria whispered as the group gathered at the eastern perimeter of the base. "We follow the shepherd paths that I marked during my weekend hikes. These routes avoid all known enemy observation points because they were designed by people who lived in these mountains long before any army arrived here." The women moved out in single file, with Maria leading based on her intimate knowledge of the terrain. The path she had chosen would take them through valleys that hadn't appeared on any military map, following ancient routes that connected remote villages and seasonal grazing areas. The distance was greater than direct military approaches, but the likelihood of enemy contact was significantly reduced. For the first 2 hours, their movement was steady and relatively quiet. The mountain paths were treacherous in the pre-dawn darkness, but Maria's months of exploration had given her an understanding of the terrain that proved invaluable. She led them around rock slides that could have caused noise, through drawers that provided concealment from observation points, and past landmarks that confirmed their progress toward the valley where Dutch's team remained trapped. As the sun began to rise, filtered through storm clouds that still provided essential concealment, the reality of their situation became increasingly clear. They were 5 women with minimal combat training, walking through enemy territory toward a position where 8 Navy SEALs had been unable to break free despite their superior training and equipment. "Contact," Gonzalez whispered urgently, raising her hand to halt the group's movement. Through her binoculars, she had spotted 2 enemy fighters moving along a ridge approximately 800 meters to their north. The fighters appeared to be conducting routine patrol, unaware of the small group moving through the valley below. The women pressed themselves against a rocky outcropping, waiting in silence as the enemy patrol continued its movement. Maria's heart hammered in her chest as she realized this was their first confirmation that they had entered the operational area, where dozens of enemy fighters were maintaining their siege of Dutch's team. "They're moving away from us," Sarah observed quietly after several tense minutes. "But this confirms that enemy forces are actively patrolling the entire region. We can't assume any area is truly safe." The group continued their advance, but the encounter had changed the psychological dynamic of their mission. They were no longer planning a rescue operation. They were actively conducting one in enemy territory, with the very real possibility of capture or death if their presence was detected. Around mid-morning, they reached a position that offered their first view of the target valley. Through her binoculars, Maria could see the rocky outcropping where intelligence reports suggested Dutch's team had established their defensive position. The distance was still considerable, perhaps 3 kilometers, but she could also see evidence of enemy positions on the surrounding ridgelines. "There," Dr. Walsh pointed to movement among the rocks. "I can see at least 4 different positions where enemy fighters have established overwatch. They have clear fields of fire covering any approach route that would be used by a conventional rescue force." Captain Martinez studied the tactical situation with her logistics training, identifying supply lines and communication routes that the enemy had established to maintain their siege. "This is a well-organized operation," she observed grimly. "They have the manpower and positioning to maintain this siege indefinitely, which means our guys are running out of time," Amy Rodriguez said quietly, her pregnancy making the physical demands of the mountain trek increasingly difficult, though her determination remained unshaken. As they observed the valley, Sarah's emergency radio crackled with weak signal transmission that she quickly suppressed. The message was brief but significant. "Base Kilo, this is Rescue 6. Weather clearing earlier than forecast. Air support may be available within 4 hours." The news created a dilemma none of them had anticipated. If air support became available, their unauthorized rescue mission could interfere with official military operations. But 4 hours might be too late for Dutch's team, and there was no guarantee that conventional air operations would be any more successful than the ground-based approaches that had already been deemed too risky. "We continue," Maria decided, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone present, including herself. "We're closer to them than any air support will be, and we're already committed to this approach. If we can reach them and establish communication, we might be able to coordinate our extraction with official air support." The final approach to the valley required the most dangerous movement of their entire mission. They would need to traverse open ground that was potentially visible from enemy positions, relying on the remaining storm cover and the unconventional nature of their approach to avoid detection. Maria led them down paths that no military manual would have recommended, following routes that required them to move in single file along narrow ledges and through drawers that offered concealment at the cost of extremely slow progress. Each step was carefully planned, each movement calculated to minimize their exposure to enemy observation. As they drew closer to the target area, they began to hear sounds that confirmed the ongoing nature of the siege. Occasional gunfire echoed from the rocky outcropping where Dutch's team maintained their position. Enemy voices could be heard calling to each other across the ridgelines, coordinating their positions and sharing information about the American forces trapped below. 200 meters, Maria whispered, indicating their distance from the defensive position where 8 American soldiers had been fighting for their lives for 4 days. They had successfully infiltrated enemy territory, crossed terrain that conventional military wisdom said was impassable for untrained personnel, and positioned themselves within potential rescue range of their objective. Now came the most dangerous part of their entire mission. Making contact with Dutch's team without alerting enemy forces to their presence and somehow accomplishing an extraction that professional soldiers with superior training and equipment had been unable to achieve. The transformation was complete. Maria Santos, who had arrived at Forward Operating Base Kilo 6 months earlier as a simple hairdresser hoping to provide beauty services to military families, was now leading a rescue mission in active enemy territory. The scissors that had styled hair for worried wives now shared space in her pack with ammunition and medical supplies. The mirror that had reflected the faces of women seeking moments of normalcy in a war zone would soon reflect the face of someone who had discovered that courage comes from the most unexpected sources. In 200 meters, they would discover whether determination and love could overcome impossible odds, or whether good intentions were sufficient armor against the brutal realities of war. The final 200 meters took Maria Santos and her team 43 minutes to traverse, moving with a patience that contradicted every instinct screaming at them to rush toward their trapped friends. Each step was planned, each pause calculated, each movement designed to bring them closer to Dutch Harrison's surrounded team. Without alerting the 63 enemy fighters who had maintained their siege for 4 days. At 150 meters, Maria could clearly see the defensive position where 8 Navy SEALs had created their last stand among a cluster of boulders and stunted mountain trees. Through her binoculars, she could identify individual team members and assess their condition. Dutch Harrison was indeed in the most exposed position, just as Amy Rodriguez had predicted, using his body to shield wounded teammates from enemy fire. The sight of Petty Officer Martinez, the team medic, working frantically over what appeared to be a seriously wounded soldier, confirmed Dr. Walsh's assessment that medical intervention was desperately needed. 2 other team members showed visible signs of injury, though they remained combat effective and continued to return fire at enemy positions. Signal mirror, Maria whispered to Sarah Chen, who produced a small emergency signaling device from her pack. They needed to establish contact with Dutch's team without using radio communication that enemy forces might intercept. The mirror system was basic but effective, using reflected sunlight to send simple coded messages. 3 short flashes. Pause. 3 short flashes. Pause. 3 short flashes. The international distress signal, modified to indicate friendly contact rather than emergency. Maria held her breath as she watched Dutch's position through her binoculars, waiting for any indication that the signal had been received. A longer pause, then Dutch himself appeared briefly from behind cover, looking directly toward their position. He raised his hand in what could have been a casual movement to anyone watching from enemy positions, but Maria recognized it as acknowledgement of their signal. Sarah Chen immediately began transmitting a more complex message using the mirror system, spelling out their identity and approximate position using a code that any military personnel would recognize. The response was immediate. Dutch used his own equipment to flash back a brief status report indicating casualty count, ammunition levels, and tactical situation. The information was not encouraging. 2 serious casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation. Ammunition supplies sufficient for perhaps another 6 hours of defensive fighting. Enemy forces maintaining active siege with no indication of withdrawal. Most critically, the team's radio communication equipment had been damaged by enemy fire, leaving them unable to coordinate with base command or potential air support. We're their only connection to rescue coordination, Captain Martinez observed grimly. The implications becoming clear to everyone present. Without radio contact, even if air support arrives, there's no way to coordinate extraction procedures. Dr. Walsh was studying the tactical situation through her binoculars, her medical training helping her assess the condition of the wounded personnel from a distance. I can see significant blood loss from at least 1 casualty, she reported quietly. We're looking at a time-critical medical situation that may not survive another 6 hours, regardless of ammunition concerns. The decision point had arrived. They could attempt to withdraw and report the team's position to base command, hoping that air support would arrive in time and somehow succeed where other rescue attempts had failed. Or they could proceed with their original plan, knowing that success would require them to accomplish something that 8 highly trained special operations soldiers had been unable to achieve. Movement to our east, Staff Sergeant Gonzalez reported urgently, her military police training helping her spot potential threats before they became immediate dangers. Through her binoculars, she had identified a group of enemy fighters repositioning along the ridgeline, apparently preparing for another assault on the surrounded Americans. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy forces were no longer content to maintain a passive siege. They were preparing for a direct assault that would overwhelm Dutch's team through sheer numbers. The arrival of air support in several hours would be meaningless if the defensive position was overrun in the next 30 minutes. "Covering fire," Maria said quietly, the words coming from some part of her mind that she had never known existed. If we can create enough confusion from an unexpected direction, Dutch's team might be able to break contact and move to a more defensible position. The plan that emerged was so simple, it bordered on madness. Maria would use her knowledge of the local terrain to position their small group where they could create maximum disruption with minimum exposure. Sarah would maintain communication with Dutch's team using mirror signals, coordinating their limited firepower to maximum effect. The other women would provide supporting fire from positions that enemy forces wouldn't expect because no military manual would recommend them. This violates every principle of tactical engagement, Gonzalez observed, though her tone suggested professional appreciation for the audacity of the approach. The enemy won't know how to respond to an attack that makes no strategic sense. Sometimes the best strategy is to do something so unexpected that the enemy can't adapt quickly enough to counter it, Maria replied, remembering something Dutch had told her months earlier when explaining why unconventional warfare sometimes succeeded where traditional approaches failed. At exactly 13:47 hours, Maria Santos gave the signal that commenced the most unlikely rescue operation in the history of Forward Operating Base Kilo. 5 women with minimal combat training opened fire on enemy positions from locations that no military force would have chosen, creating confusion and disruption that allowed 8 surrounded Navy SEALs to begin fighting their way toward extraction. The scissors that had styled hair for military wives were forgotten in Maria's pack, replaced by a rifle that she fired with surprising accuracy at targets she had never imagined she would need to engage. The mirror that had reflected the faces of women seeking beauty treatments now reflected muzzle flashes and explosions as the peaceful hairdresser discovered reserves of courage she had never known she possessed. Dr. Walsh moved through enemy fire with the focused determination of someone trained to save lives regardless of personal risk, reaching the wounded SEAL team members and providing medical care that would prove the difference between survival and death. Captain Martinez used her logistics expertise to coordinate ammunition distribution and evacuation routes that maximized their limited resources while minimizing exposure to enemy counterattack. The battle lasted 17 minutes of intense combat that felt like hours, with Maria's team providing covering fire while Dutch SEALs fought their way toward more defensible terrain. The unconventional approach created exactly the confusion Maria had hoped for, with enemy forces unable to coordinate effective responses to attacks coming from directions they had never anticipated. When the shooting finally stopped, 13 people were moving together toward an extraction point that Maria had identified during her weekend hikes, a location that didn't appear on any military map but offered concealment and accessibility for helicopter rescue operations. Dutch Harrison, the professional soldier who had always protected others, found himself being protected by a hairdresser who had discovered that courage comes in many forms. The helicopter that extracted them 43 minutes later carried 8 Navy SEALs and 5 women who had proven that heroism isn't limited to those wearing uniforms. Maria Santos returned to Forward Operating Base Kilo as someone completely different from the hairdresser who had left before dawn, though she planned to reopen her salon the next day because the women on the base still needed someone who understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with love, determination, and refusal to accept that nothing can be done when people you care about need help. The official after-action reports would describe the rescue in terms of tactical innovations and successful coordination between regular and irregular forces. But Maria knew the truth was much simpler. Sometimes ordinary people accomplish extraordinary things because they refuse to accept that good people should die, while others watch helplessly from safety. Her salon reopened 3 days later, and the first customer was Emma Harrison, who had returned from the States after receiving word about her husband's rescue. As Maria worked on Emma's hair, they talked about children and home and all the normal things that military families discuss. Neither mentioned that Maria's hands, which were now gently styling hair, had fired a weapon in combat just days earlier. But Emma knew, and Maria knew, and everyone on Forward Operating Base Kilo knew that the hairdresser who cut their hair was also the woman who had walked into enemy territory and helped save 8 American soldiers from certain death. Sometimes heroism comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes courage is found not in training or equipment, but in love and determination, and the simple refusal to accept defeat when people you care about are in danger. And sometimes the most important battles are won not by armies, but by ordinary people who discover that they are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Maria Santos had come to Afghanistan as a hairdresser. She remained a hairdresser, but she had also become something else. Proof that the human spirit, when motivated by love and guided by determination, can overcome odds that seem impossible and achieve victories that military science says should never happen. The war continued, but one small corner of it had been won not by superior firepower or advanced tactics, but by a woman with scissors who refused to let good people die while she had the power to help them. In the end, that refusal to accept defeat became the weapon that mattered most.